Hi everyone and welcome back. We are joined today by the great Professor Jeffrey Sachs to discuss the possibility of war over Taiwan. So thank you again for coming back on the program.
Glenn, great to be with you as always. Thanks.
So, well, there is a great risk that this economic rivalry between the United States and China could escalate into war. And if a war would happen, then Taiwan seems like the most likely trigger. So I therefore first I want to ask, do you see a path for Taiwan to become another Ukraine? That is a proxy war that risks growing into a wider, direct war.
Absolutely. There are a lot of parallels with Ukraine. Ukraine became, in the American mind, contested territory in a contest with Russia. Who would control Ukraine? It's a strange question. The answer in the case of Ukraine should have been that Ukraine would be left neutral as its original constitution and as its government 15 years ago wanted. But for the U.S., neutrality was not good enough. So the U.S. Participated in a coup in 2014 that brought in a pro-NATO government. And there's been a contest that turned into, of course, a devastating war over the future of Ukraine. Taiwan, of course, has many completely different historical roots, but there is a kind of contest underway. And of course, as in the case of Ukraine, it also involves very active Taiwanese politics. Taiwan is a place of complexity in Chinese history, and without the long panorama, it was part of the Qing dynasty until Japan took Taiwan as a colony in 1895 after winning the Sino-Japanese War. And Japan ruled Taiwan as a colony from 1895 to 1945. At that time, when Japan was defeated in World War II, Taiwan returned to China, to what was then the Republic of China, under the rule of Chiang Kai-shek. But a civil war broke out in China soon after that between the communist-led side under Mao Zedong and the nationalist government of the Republic of China under Chiang Kai-shek. And in 1949, the communists won, declared the People's Republic of China with the capital in Beijing, and Chiang Kai-shek defeated and evacuated to the island of Taiwan and declared the rule of the Republic of China with the capital in Taipei. And that's the roots of today's complexity. There were, in 1949, two competitors. One had won the mainland, the other had evacuated to the island. Both declared one China. The mainland government declared the People's Republic of China as the ruler of all of China, that is mainland Taiwan and other islands, whereas Taiwan declared the Republic of China, the ruler of one China, mainland and islands. But of course, the Republic of China only controlled Taiwan and surrounding islands, whereas the mainland controlled, or the People's Republic of China was the mainland and the vast territory and population of China. But there was on both sides of the Taiwan Straits the idea of one China, just contesting who would rule China. Well, again, the complexities are enormous, but the United States was the ally of the Republic of China in World War II and was fervently anti-communist after World War II. And so when the Civil War ended, the United States continued to recognize the Republic of China on the island of Taiwan and did not recognize the People's Republic of China. Of course, the vast, vast, vast majority of China was in the mainland, and therefore it was governed by the People's Republic of China. The United Nations recognized that fact against U.S. opposition in 1971. And so the seat at the UN for China and in the Security Council that had been held by Taiwan, that is the Republic of China, up until 1971, from the founding of the UN, shifted to the People's Republic of China. Now, Taiwan was no longer represented in the UN, and the mainland, the People's Republic of China, said that diplomatic relations with the PRC of any other country, by any other country, meant that that country would subscribe to the one China policy, that there was only one Chinese government, that it represented all of China, and that that government was the People's Republic of China with the capital in Beijing. So all over the world, almost all countries with what was then some dozens, but now very, very few, recognized the People's Republic of China. The United States shifted its recognition in that way in 1979, ending its recognition of the Republic of China at Taiwan and diplomatically recognizing the People's Republic of China. And that also initiated an era of close economic relations between what was then a quite poor mainland and the United States. And the mainland became the producer of a lot of basic industrial goods and inputs and assembly operations for the U.S. economy. And on that basis, the People's Republic of China experienced remarkable economic growth. One could say justifiably, I think, the greatest economic reform period in world history, perhaps from 1980 to now, becoming a extremely sophisticated, modern, technologically cutting-edge economy that in absolute size, according to purchasing power parity, is bigger than the U.S. economy now. Well, all of this meant that for some decades, Taiwan was on the margins, but when the U.S. shifted its diplomatic recognition, it also passed U.S. legislation saying that it would continue to support Taiwan's status in rejecting any forcible reunification of the island with the mainland. Whereas the mainland said, of course, Taiwan is part of one China. And actually, Taiwan said, yes, Taiwan is part of one China under the Republic of China Constitution, which still prevails. The idea of Taiwan and the United States was that Taiwan would have a path of autonomy, let's say, de facto independent, not in a political sovereign sense, but in a daily behavioral sense of politics and economics and governance, and that the United States would protect Taiwan against any forcible reunification attempted by the mainland. That's more or less a description of the status quo now. But things have gotten much more complicated, if I may say. And the reason is that both Taiwan and the mainland became extraordinarily successful economically. And that has led to massive political and geopolitical changes as well. In the case of Taiwan, this great boom started actually before the mainland's boom. So Taiwan's boom started in the 1960s, and Taiwan became one of the Asian tiger economies. It grew very rapidly. And then starting in the 1990s, it actually became home to the most advanced semiconductor chip fabrication in the world with TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation. And this company produces about 90% or more of the most advanced chips in the whole world. So Taiwan achieved a spectacular economic success. And in that context, Chiang Kai-shek, the original ruler, died in 1975. Soon after, his son became the second ruler of what was then an authoritarian government. But starting in the 1980s, it began to liberalize and to democratize. And in the 1990s, went to an electoral democratic system. And in 1996, elected its first freely elected democratic president. So the political path of Taiwan became a democracy. At the same time, starting roughly 15 years after Taiwan's takeoff, maybe 20, but roughly 15 years, China began its rapid ascent. And China experienced this incredible economic growth for 40 years, roughly 10% per year. And in the case of China, that provoked a geopolitical reaction from the United States. The geopolitical reaction was that the U.S. political class came to view China first as a concern, then as a threat, and now, though the term isn't maybe always used, de facto as an enemy. This is, in my opinion, a terrible misconception. It's a kind of paranoia or an attempt by the United States to maintain a hegemony that it doesn't have. I believe the U.S. has delusions of power. I'm talking about the U.S. political class. They don't understand we're in a multipolar world. They want to be in a U.S.-only led world. China is an affront to that. So starting roughly a decade ago, the U.S. turned to quite hostile policies vis-a-vis China. And you mentioned the trade war as one of those instruments, but it goes well beyond the trade war. It goes to military buildup in East Asia, in the Philippines, in Korea, in Japan, in other U.S. military bases. It goes to diplomacy, creating anti-China instruments like the Quad or AUKUS. It goes to technology export bans and overt attempts to contain China's growth. And this has been going on for a decade. So finally, put Taiwan back into this story. From inside Taiwan, there is a long-term trend towards wanting independence, a democratic system, a new generation of young people without the emotional or experiential ties to the mainland, unlike their parents and grandparents. And so there's a growing movement towards independence. On the mainland side, there's a growing movement with political and military and financial power to saying, no way, we are now reunifying. Believe it, because China is so strong. And on the United States side, there is, on the one part, angst about China's strength. There is a pretty broad-based attempt to weaken China in any way, and for mischievous, I think dangerous American politicians, they see Taiwan as something to play with in a way, against China, in the same way that many in the U.S. saw Ukraine as something to provoke Russia. The U.S. support for Ukraine's NATO membership was mostly about the U.S. and to weaken Russia, not about Ukraine itself, which ended up losing badly in this proxy war between the U.S. and Russia. So Taiwan is now part of a contest between China and the United States. And China says, don't you dare intervene in our internal policy. There is one China. We have said it from the beginning. Footnote, so has the Republic of China in Taipei said it from 1949. There is one China. Don't you, the United States, come into the middle of this. The U.S., by contrast, says, we're there from the beginning. And we have the right and the duty and the determination to protect Taiwan against any kind of military incursion or forced reunification from the mainland. Don't you dare think about using force. And while we have technically a strategic ambiguity as to whether we would militarily support Taiwan, in fact, President Biden said on repeated occasions, yes, we would defend Taiwan. And so this is indeed a very hot situation and a very dangerous situation. Three actors, China, capital in Beijing of the People's Republic of China, that says there is one China and nobody should think differently, and reunification is a historic must. It's going to happen, and if it has to happen by force, that's not ruled out. Taiwan politically is divided into many different groups. Those who say prudently maintain the status quo, those who say we should aim for reunification, those who say we should aim for independence. So the politics in Taiwan is very lively indeed. And the United States is saying we reserve the right to defend Taiwan. We reserve the right to arm Taiwan over PRC objections. We reserve the right to visit Taiwan, to have meetings with politicians. It's very fraught, and it reminds me a lot of Ukraine, and a misstep by any of the actors could lead to a devastating conflict.
Yeah, I think it's a good point that almost the entire world recognizes, though, that there is one China, because I often see journalists write something along the lines that China thinks that Taiwan is part of China, but this is the in almost entire international system. Indeed, peace between these two great powers, the United States and China, is built on this one China policy. And but the one China policy from the 70s, though, it suggested the US would limit itself to cultural and economic cooperation with the island. But it seems that the problem also, which I guess links a bit to the Ukraine problem, has always been this incrementalism, that there's these small steps, because we see in the small steps, we see more US presence and cooperation with Taiwan, a little bit more high-level political ties with Taiwan, some more demands for political representation in international institutions for Taiwan. And this incrementalism seems to be part of the concerns of China. Why doesn't want to give an inch in any negotiation? Because if it gives an inch, then it will have to wait for the next step for a little bit more and a little bit more. But do you see this as the provocations happening now, or from the American side, or is this how does Washington see it? Do they actually imagine or want to have a war? Because I don't see any good outcome for anyone. Or is this a deliberate provocation then, or do they seek for the Chinese to stand down? Or in other words, would this be an accidental path towards war?
I think we should also just spend one more moment on the history of Taiwan to understand the situation precisely. Taiwan, for hundreds of years, was part of the Qing dynasty, and this goes back to the 17th century for a brief period of time roughly the same 4 decades as where I live, Manhattan, New York. It was part of a Dutch empire, but then it reverted to Chinese rule, first of a renegade Ming warlord, and then of the Qing dynasty at the end of the 17th century. And for about 300 years, no doubt, it was part of the Qing dynasty, not a contested issue. It was Japan that wrested Taiwan away from the mainland by the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95. During World War II, there was a great power conference in Cairo that brought Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the Republic of China, together. And it was pledged at the Cairo conference that at the end of World War II, with the defeat of the Japanese, Taiwan would revert to China. This was not ambiguous. This is clear. In Potsdam, the final conference just after the defeat of the Germans, but before the defeat of the Japanese, the Cairo conference conclusions and determinations were reconfirmed in Potsdam, Germany, by the leaders of Russia, Britain, and the United States. So the idea that Taiwan is part of one China is historically accurate, and it is also reconfirmed in World War II. And then it was reconfirmed in the constitutions, as I said, of both the People's Republic of China and the Republic of China. The issue wasn't whether there were two separate countries. The issue was who governed a unified China. So the issues about independence are recent issues. It is ahistorical to question this point, actually. It is a current development. One could argue whatever about the current situation, but the history is not an ambiguous history. Of course, as Orwell said, he who controls the present controls the past, and he who controls the past controls the future. So there's a lot of attempt to manipulate the past history. But I think, looking from the outside, that this is a question of who rules China, not a question of two Chinas. Of course, the evolution of the two places is quite different. One can very much admire Taiwan's achievements and so forth. One can abjure any kind of force. That all makes sense. But this questioning about one China and two Chinas, not only a questioning of the diplomacy of the last 50 years, but I would say the history of the last 300 plus years. And so this I just wanted to put on the table. Now, in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the United States was arming Taiwan. And in a communique in 1982, the United States said it would continue to arm Taiwan, but at a diminishing rate, that it would phase out its military support. Well, now we are 43 years later, and the drumbeat of arming Taiwan, and the expression is like a porcupine, so that the mainland wouldn't be able to occupy Taiwan, grows in Washington. That's mostly a geopolitical game, if I could put it that way. Politicians in Washington don't care very much about other places. They care about American power, American influence, American prestige. They care about the fact that America's backing of Taiwan, in their view, is vital for the confidence of Japan and Korea in the American led defense of those two countries and in America's presence in East Asia. So they see Taiwan a bit like they see Ukraine, as a matter of American prestige, credibility, ability to project power. Taiwan per se, I don't think is high on almost anybody's mind in Washington. They're geographically ignorant, culturally ignorant, and very inward looking, so they don't really care about any other place in my experience in dealing with these politicians. But they do see America's prestige on the line. And when you talk about prestige, you know how easily that can convert to war. And then when war starts, the prestige question becomes even more important. The dominoes will fall. All terrible things will happen if we don't stand up for our prestige. Well, this is, of course, the ruin of countries and the ruin of the world, this kind of talk. So I would say, yes, it would be a kind of accidental war, but not an accidental motive. The motive is U.S. power, a U.S. presence in East Asia, U.S. determination, a U.S. demonstration to Japan, to Korea, to Australia, to the Philippines, to Southeast Asia. We are there. We will not be moved. We won't let China, meaning the PRC, bully us around. Those are the motives right now that drive the U.S.
It just seems that given the history which you outlined, that you can always have a solution between Taiwan and mainland China in terms of enhanced autonomy or something. But it's the geopolitics that complicates it. As you said, with Ukraine, the objective, I guess, is to create a Europe without Russia to push them into Asia. But with Taiwan, Taiwan is very important to the regional security architecture as part of this island chain, and also as a possible way of putting this economic containment of China, and especially now that it's becoming more difficult to compete economically.
Well, this raises another point that is in line with what we've been discussing, but two more features that are important. First, in the mainland view, the outside world is out to weaken or destroy or divide China. This is not wrong, and it's also part of the historical experience. It's not strictly right in that this may refer to some intemperate politicians in the United States mainly, but they're there. That's real. So China has its so-called Century of Humiliation, in which outside powers divided, weakened, and in many ways devastated China, starting with the British, as is usually true, in 1839 in the First Opium War. Then there was the French and British in the Second Opium War at mid-century. There was a great civil war in China that emerged from that, the Taiping Rebellion, as it's called by Western historians. But that was perhaps the largest civil war in world history, with tens of millions of deaths. Then there was the incursions at the end of the century, the most dire of which was the Japanese invasion of China in 1894-95, in which both Taiwan was lost and Korea was on the first step to becoming a colony, which happened in 1910. Then, of course, Japan invaded China in 1931 and devastated China in war until 1945, with tens of millions of people, or estimated between 10 and 20 million people dead in World War II as a result of the Japanese war. So from the Chinese perspective, never again will China be divided from the outside. And so there's a particular neuralgia about Taiwan. Oh, look, they're at it again. They're out to weaken us. They're out to divide us. This was a complete devastation. From the U.S. side, the U.S. has been a foe of communist China because the U.S. has this deep anti-communism in its mentality, even when the term is in the Chinese characteristic, so-called. This is a super sophisticated mixed economy, private capital galore, mixed economy, a public sector as well. But in the U.S. mentality, communism has been the evil for a century since the Bolshevik Revolution. And in the case of China, already with the founding of the People's Republic of China, the U.S. backed Taiwan in this war against communism. And then in 1951, John Foster Dulles, who would go on to become the fervent anti-communist foreign minister, Secretary of State of the United States under Dwight Eisenhower, identified the so-called First Island Chain, which is a chain, an archipelago that the United States would defend, including Taiwan, Japan, the Philippines, Guam. And this idea was if the U.S. controls this chain, it limits China's access, including submarine access and naval access more generally, to the wider Pacific Ocean. It hems China in. It threatens China's sea routes. It makes possible chokeholds over China's food supplies coming from abroad and its energy resources coming from abroad. That first island chain became part of U.S. military doctrine. China understands that. This is, again, part of this right now almost a Cold War, or maybe a Cold War between the U.S. and China. And so this is another reason why there's this depth, not only maybe I left an impression of symbolism of American power or desire to weaken China, but military doctrine and strategic doctrine, and on the Chinese side, a deep awareness of history and a determination not again to be subjected to the Western powers, which did such devastation, or Japan, which, as it itself said at the end of the 19th century, joined the Western imperial club.
I think this history and ideology is very important because when you end up in a strategic situation where winner takes all and neither side is willing to give an inch, you usually wandering into very dangerous territory. And when it involves the two greatest power in the international system, we do have a problem. But yeah, Professor Sachs, thank you so much, as always, for your time. I know you're a very busy man, so I'll want to add more of your time.
Just to say, we need, above all, prudence and peace here, because if it were not for the U.S. meddling, I'm quite sure that across the straits there would be a solution to these issues that is peaceful, sensible, and especially pragmatic. And if the world, and God help us, politicians in the United States, are pragmatic and prudent, then peace will prevail. If they are delusional, as they were in Ukraine, hot-headed, arrogant, reckless, provocative, then Taiwan could become a flashpoint, and a very dangerous one.
That's a great warning. So thanks again.
Great to be with you.
Bye.
Thanks. See you soon. Bye-bye.